Treisman, who is also not a very, very distinguished professor of political science, but is also the member of the International Expert Council, or committee, how we call this, which is going to assemble tomorrow. And maybe Daniel forgot this, but it turns out you are the member of the board of one of the 2 or 3 policy journals in Russia, and I was asked by Sviatoslav Kasper, who is the editor-in-chief and who is in Tyumen now, I have no idea what he's doing there, to pass to you the 3 latest volumes. Doesn't mean you need to take them back home, but you may want to scan them. At least number 1, where is my article about the neoconservative consensus in Russia. And without much ado, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andre. Thank you, everybody, for coming. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk about a paper which is titled Democracy by Mistake. And the question that I address in this paper is a familiar one. It's how democratization occurs. This is, in a sense, a bit of a puzzle, because for democracy to appear in a country, usually that means that the previous authoritarian regime has to give up power, or at least share its power. And most authoritarian leaders don't want to do that. So why would they agree to give up part of their power or all of their power? Well, there are a number of theories which people have proposed to explain why they might choose to do that, why they might deliberately democratize. So one argument is that ruling elites deliberately democratize in order to credibly commit to future income redistribution. If they're afraid that the poor are going to revolt, there's going to be a revolution, and they'll be expropriated, then, as Asimoglu and Robinson argue, it may make sense for the incumbent elite to democratize, because this will credibly commit to future redistribution of income, even though if they were simply to promise income redistribution in the future, that would not be credible. Another argument is that incumbents democratize in order to motivate the population to fight in a war. This is an argument, well, it's quite an old argument. It goes back at least to Max Weber. There's a more recent paper by Tiki and Vindini. The idea is that in order to get ordinary people to join the army, to fight to defend the elite when it's attacked from outside, you need to give the people rights. Another argument proposed by two economists, Alessandro Lizzeri and Nicola Persico, is that democracy emerges, or that the elite chooses democracy as a mechanism to make it rational to provide public goods rather than patronage as a way to maintain support. The idea there is that if you enlarge, if you expand the franchise, if you enlarge the set of people who are voting, then public goods become a more efficient way of reaching that constituency relative to patronage, which can work well only in relatively small groups. So that's another argument about why it might be rational for incumbents to democratize. Another argument is that perhaps one party in a narrow oligarchical system might expand the franchise, thinking that the new voters are going to support it. So in competition within the elite, it may seem rational for one faction within the elite to democratize, thinking that it'll increase its support by doing so. And finally, there are some arguments that elites agree to democracy basically as a compromise, as a solution for endemic conflict. If you have factions that have been fighting for decades, and eventually they come to realize that neither of them will have an ultimate victory. Maybe they negotiate a great compromise or a pact under which they institutionalize some sharing of power. This is an argument that's associated with Rusto from 1970. And discussion of pacts was very important in analysis of democratization in the 1980s and 90s, scholars like O'Donnell and Schmidt. Okay, so a whole set of arguments about why an incumbent elite might quite rationally and consciously and deliberately choose to democratize. And I want to emphasize that this is really a central assumption of all those theories, that the elite means to give up or to share power. It's intentional. But does the elite typically mean to share power? Is that really how democracy emerges? Well, reading the history, in fact, you find a lot of evidence of miscalculation. Rather than careful planning about how to create these new institutions to further some interest of the elite, there are stories which suggest a great deal of chaos, myopia, and error. And one great example is the one that relates to this cartoon here. The guy you see is Louis Philippe of France. This is 1848. Louis Philippe is the king, and Republican reformers start to organize to try and pressure Louis Philippe to undertake what are really very minor reforms. They want to expand the franchise a little bit. Louis Philippe says no. The reformers start holding a series of what were called reform banquets, dinners at which they would meet, they would give speeches, and that was basically it. But the last banquet in the series was going to take place in Paris. And Louis Philippe's prime minister, François Guizot, bans that last reform banquet. And this makes people very angry. They go out in the streets and demonstrate. And then, unfortunately, troops, which the king sent out to maintain control, shoot at least 40 of the protesters. And this inflames public opinion even more. Protests escalate. Louis Philippe has, first of all, given in to public pressure and fired his prime minister Guizot, who had become so unpopular, gone through one prime minister and then a second. So the last prime minister is called Adolphe Thiers. Adolphe Thiers comes to Louis Philippe late at night and says, "Your Majesty, you simply have to introduce a minor reform. You don't have to change things very much, but still, just 50 or 100,000 more voters, and things will calm down." Louis Philippe says, "No, absolutely not. We're going to intimidate them. I have this very tough general called Bugeaud, and that will take care of this." A few days later, he's been forced out, he's abdicated, and he's sleeping in a farmhouse on his way to exile in England. Okay, that's just to give you a sense of how sometimes democracy emerges. Democracy, in that case, was introduced, universal franchise was introduced by some of the revolutionaries who ended up in a provisional government after Louis Philippe fled. So with this kind of historical example in mind, I came to the following conjecture. That democracy often emerges, or historically emerged, not because the incumbents deliberately chose democracy, but because in trying to prevent it, they messed up. So in this sense, democracy was, for the elite, a mistake. Now, my research strategy in this paper is the following. First of all, I tried to identify all the cases of democratization that had occurred since 1800 or 1820. And I used three alternative, widely used definitions, so people couldn't say, well, this is only true if you use a particular definition. So I used two definitions, make use of the polity 4, data on democracy. One of the definitions is a jump in the polity 2 score of the country of 6 points within 3 years. Now, the polity 2 scale runs from -10, which is a pure autocracy, to +10, which is a pure democracy. And so a jump of 6 points is a pretty big increase in the democratic direction. So this is a criterion that some people have used before. That was my first definition. A country that increases its polity 2 score by 6 points in 3 years. The second criterion, also from polity 2, is what the polity 2 team calls a major democratic transition. What that is first of all, a jump of 6 points in 3 years, but in addition, you have to move from the part of the scale which is from -10 to 0 up to the positive part of the scale, or you need to move from the range 0 to 6 to above 6. To above 5, so from 6 to 10. Now 6 to 10, according to the polity 2 people, is democracy. Anything below that is one or another form of authoritarian rule. Okay, so that's the second criterion, which various scholars have also used in past work. The third democracy definition uses some data collected by Carlos Bosch and his colleagues. And this is a simple dichotomous variable. So countries are either democracies or not, zeros or ones. And to be a democracy in the Bosch definition, the country's head of the executive has to be directly elected by more than, or at least 50% of the male population. So the electorate has to include at least 50% of the male population, has to be elected in reasonably free and fair elections, or else indirectly elected by a parliament that is elected in free and fair elections with a franchise of at least 50% of the male population. Okay, so that's what a democracy is, and democratization is simply a move from 0 to 1, crossing that threshold. Okay, so using those three alternative definitions of democracy, I identified 201 cases in history in which this happened. Now, the cases differ a little bit across the definitions. As you might expect, there's a huge overlap between them, but there are some which come out as democratization in some criteria, not in others. So I looked at all of them, all these 201. In fact, I should say, there were about 218 in total, but about 17, or exactly 17 of those cases, when I looked at them closely, they were not cases of democratization. I've discussed with the polity people, with Carlos Bosch and Michael Miller and his colleagues. They were, well, things like simply miscoded cases, or for the Bosch-Miller-Rosado data, if a country, if simply because of increasing literacy, more than 50% of the males come to pass the literacy requirement in a country, the country shifts from not a democracy to a democracy under the criterion, but nothing has changed at all in the politics. Some more people have become literate. So it's not reasonable to think of that as a case of democratic reform. Okay, but basic point, 201 cases which do appear to be democracies under one or more of these criteria. So what did I do? I looked at each of these 201 cases. I read the history from history books and articles, newspapers, memoirs, interviews with participants, other sources, whatever I could find on each of these cases to try and understand it as best I could. And for each of the cases, I categorized whether the case could at least somewhat plausibly fit each of those deliberate choice theories or explanations that I mentioned at the start. Democratization as a way to commit credibly to future redistribution, democratization to motivate the population to fight war, and so on. And I I set the bar low, so I didn't say I would only code it as fitting the explanation if it fit perfectly, just if at least somewhat plausibly it could fit with that explanation, even if there are details perhaps that don't fit so well. So I tried to give the arguments the benefit of the doubt. And I also coded whether in each case democratization resulted from some mistake or mistakes by the incumbent, and if so, I noted down what kind of mistake. Okay, so it took me about 5 years, off and on, to read the history of all these cases. It was incredibly interesting. I enjoyed it a lot, but it wasn't a 1-month project or anything like that. Okay, so what do I mean by a mistake? Well, I mean specifically a course of action or inaction, the expected payoff of which is lower than that of some other feasible course. So, in the language of game theory, a mistake is an action that is off the equilibrium path in a game of complete and perfect information. And I argue there are two main kinds of mistakes that are relevant to this project. There are errors of information and there are errors of calculation. An error of information is the choice of a course of action which may be optimal given the information of the actor, but the information of the actor is wrong. So you do the wrong thing because you're misinformed, because you have the wrong beliefs about the world. An error of calculation is what you do when you choose an option which is not optimal, which is not the best available course, even though you have correct information. So your calculation is wrong, your logic is wrong, rather than your information. Okay, so we see both of those kinds of mistake. I should state a few caveats, because this is actually kind of subtle. So not all actions that have undesired outcomes, not all actions that go wrong are mistakes. For instance, you may take a gamble that is optimal, ex ante, but you can still lose. If you lose a gamble, if you buy a lottery ticket and you lose, that doesn't mean that it was irrational, that it was a mistake, that there was a better course of action just because you lost. Or perhaps all the available courses of action are undesirable. None of them are good options, and you pick the lesser evil. Okay, so the outcome is undesired, but it wasn't a mistake. You still picked the best available option. So I don't call something like that a mistake. Conversely, an action can be a mistake, even if all the options were bad. Right? So long as at least one other feasible course, one other feasible action, had a higher expected payoff than the one you chose. In that case, you did make a mistake. And I don't assume that leaders always prioritize staying in power. If a leader steps down, leaves office in order to prevent bloodshed, that's not in itself a mistake. If, by taking a different action previously, the leader could have avoided having to step down in order to avoid bloodshed, then maybe it was a mistake. And just to be clear, I'm not saying that dictators are stupid. So there's a great quote from Cicero. Cicero wrote, "We must not say that every mistake is a foolish one." Being a dictator is extremely hard. There are an enormous number of considerations you have to keep in mind. There's treachery around every corner. It's almost impossible to have all the information that you need at your fingertips. So it doesn't surprise me at all that rulers, dictators, even democratic rulers, would make a lot of mistakes. Ruling's difficult. But I am suggesting that democratization may have resulted, historically, less from deliberate choice by elites, with correct information and correct strategic logic, than from misperceptions and miscalculations. Okay, so that's what I want to do. Okay, so what are the results of all this reading? Well, based on my review of the historical evidence, the deliberate choice explanations that I mentioned at the start could, at least somewhat plausibly, in my judgment, help explain democratization in up to about a third of the cases. Mistakes by the incumbents, I think, were important in about 2/3 of the cases. And for each case, I prepared a detailed synopsis of the historical facts, as best I could make them out, historians' interpretations, and so on, to justify my codings. So if anybody's interested, you'll be able to go to my spreadsheet, see my argument about each case, why it does fit an argument or why it doesn't, whether a mistake was made, and also you'll be able to read the synopsis of the case that I prepared and see if you agree or not. And ultimately, this sort of work, it has to be validated by people with detailed historical knowledge of the cases who can read and see if I reached the right conclusion or the wrong conclusion about each of these cases, and ultimately whether, if I did make some mistakes myself, which of course is possible, whether correcting those would change the general pattern that I found. I'm more doubtful about that than I am that there may be particular cases where somebody could reasonably reach a different conclusion. Okay, so just to run through then, first of all, the deliberate choice explanations. So the first argument that elites democratize in order to commit themselves to redistribute in the future and forestall a revolution. Well, I found that could possibly have contributed in 6 to 8% of the cases. And the reason there's a range there is, remember I had these 3 different definitions of democracy. And some of the same cases show up for the different definitions. So it may be 6% under one definition and 8% of the cases under another definition. Okay, so about 6 to 8% seem to fit this argument. For example, the United Kingdom in 1884, so the third Great Reform Act, moved by Gladstone in 1884, there had been some fairly serious protests by agricultural laborers before the debate in Parliament. I don't think this can explain why Gladstone brought the bill forward, or why Gladstone initially became committed to democratic reform, because that happened quite a bit earlier in the late 1870s, and at that time there wasn't serious, or historians suggest there wasn't serious pressure coming from protests, or definitely protests of agricultural workers. But in 1884 there was, and this may have influenced the House of Lords to accept, ultimately, Gladstone's bill. South Africa in 1994 seems to me a good example of this logic in action. What about motivating citizens to fight in a war, or I added in civil war here? Well, about 4 to 5% of the cases could possibly fit there. For instance, in 1911, the Prime Minister of Italy, Giolitti, sends troops to invade Libya. And in 1912, he introduces a big extension of the franchise. And some people, there were other reasons as well for this, but some people have argued that part of it was that with Italian troops fighting in the Libyan desert, there was a strong moral argument for giving the right to vote to more of the adult male population. What about substituting public goods for patronage? Well, I found maybe 4% of cases where that could perhaps fit. There's a nice case in the Ottoman Empire in the 1870s where the Sultan, under the influence of his vizier, introduces a reform which aims to reduce corruption it fits this argument beautifully. Unfortunately, it was taken back the next year. And if I remember right, the Sultan was overthrown. But still, it's a case that seems to fit. What about winning supporters in intra-elite competition? So one party democratizing, hoping to pick up votes from the newly enfranchised voters. Yeah, I think this actually also fits the United Kingdom in 1884, Uruguay in 1915 to 1916. Great compromise among factions were packed. Slightly more support for this argument. In fact, these two arguments most of the time overlap. There's a few exceptions. But usually when you have a great compromise among factions, there's also a pact. They're not always. So 14 to 16% of the cases, or 16 to 19% of the cases. Okay, and these deliberate choice arguments, as I said, at least one of them seems to apply, or could apply, in up to about a third of the cases. What about mistakes by incumbents? And now I'm going to tell you what types of mistakes authoritarian leaders often make. Well, first of all, there's actually two kinds of mistake which I refer to as hubris, sort of extreme overconfidence. And the first mistake is to ignore warnings and to get overthrown in a mass revolt when plausibly the leader could have taken some other action which would have lowered the odds of getting overthrown. And this is very much the case that I mentioned earlier on of Louis Philippe in France in 1848. So there's a threat. Rather than making some minor concessions or using repression effectively to stabilize things, the leader ignores the warnings and is overthrown. And after that, democracy emerges. Okay, second kind of hubris. A leader calls an election or a referendum and then does very badly. This undermines their support, often within the elite, and it destabilizes the previous status quo, and they basically either get overthrown or are forced to reform. And a great case of this is Pinochet in Chile in 1988. He calls a referendum on the future of the regime. To his amazement, he loses. And he tries, if you believe the accounts of participants, he tries to get the other generals to impose a state of emergency and to cancel the result. They refuse. So his authority within the regime disappears at that point, and he is forced to negotiate a transition which, I should say, leaves a lot of the cards in the hands of the military, but nevertheless, which does result in democracy. Third type of mistake, the military adventure. You start a war, or you enter a war, and you lose. This undermines your situation. So think of General Galtieri in Argentina in 1982. Argentina invades the Falkland Islands, thinking that Britain will accept that. Britain sends a fleet which retakes them. This is the last straw which undermines the support for Galtieri and the military junta, and pretty soon they hand over the power. Another type of mistake is what I call the slippery slope. So a leader starts a partial reform, thinking that he'll be able to keep this under control, that it will stabilize the regime. But then he loses control, the reform goes further than he had planned, and he ends up being forced to share or give up power. So here, think of Gorbachev in the Soviet Union. This type of mistake occurred in about a third of the cases in my coding. Okay, another mistake is not so much a mistake of the central individual as a mistake of the rest of the elite, or the mainstream faction of the elite. So the elite appoints a leader who it thinks is going to preserve the regime, who thinks is committed to keeping the regime as it is, but that leader turns out to be a covert Democrat, or reformer, or something else, and in any case, destroys the regime. And here, prime example, examples are Juan Carlos, the prince who Franco in Spain made his successor, made the king, and Adolphus Suarez, the prime minister, who is a career member of the fascist bureaucracy under Franco, but when appointed prime minister, who systematically took apart the structures of power in fascist Spain after Franco's death. So the old fascist establishment was extremely upset about what those guys did, but it was too late at that point to do anything about it. So trusting a traitor, appointing the wrong guy, is another mistake. And finally, counterproductive violence. So sometimes a leader uses violence where it's not actually helpful. In fact, it's positively unhelpful and it destabilizes the regime. So one example was Ershad in Bangladesh in 1990. You could say, to be a little bit more provocative, Ukraine in 2013, the use of violence in November, which actually inflamed the protests even more. Okay, so that's just a picture of the results, but you may be wondering, well, okay, sitting there with books, how do I actually decide how to classify cases? How do I make these judgments? So to give you a sense of this, let me go through one example, Greece in 1974. So in 1967, a junta of colonels seizes power in Greece, and then in 1974, civilian rule is restored, so that databases agree that this was a case of democratization. So do the details of this case fit any of the deliberate choice explanations? Well, let's see. First of all, did a rich elite democratize to commit to redistribution to the poor and thus to prevent revolution? So the Asimov-Robinson argument. Okay, well, first of all, the incumbents in this case were not a rich elite. They were one faction in the military. And the junta in 1974, which was under the office of Brigadier Dimitrios Ioannidis, at that point they had no intention of democratizing. In fact, Ioannidis had seized power, overthrowing the previous leader of the junta, who was called Georgios Papadopoulos. Because Papadopoulos had started to democratize, or it started to liberalize politically, and Ioannidis was dead set against that. So they didn't want to democratize. There were protests, which in a sense fits this argument. They were led by students rather than the poor. And in any case, the colonels didn't respond by making democratic concessions, by creating more democratic institutions or enfranchising them. They sent tanks to crush the student protesters. And ultimately, the regime lost power when, responding to the Turkish invasion of Cyprus, leading generals overthrew Ioannidis, and they then appointed a conservative Greek politician who'd been prime minister before, called Konstantinos Karamanlis, as prime minister, to be a transitional guarantor of the system in the return to democracy. And reading the history and what the historian said, there seems to have been no commitment to redistribution involved in that transition at all. Okay, so that explanation, in my judgment, does not help with that case. Okay, what about the next one? Did the military democratize to motivate citizens to fight or to reward them for fighting? Well, the conflict with Turkey was the trigger for the junta's collapse. So the junta had provoked or organized an attempted coup in Cyprus. This threatened the Turks, who thought that perhaps the Greeks were going to take over the whole of the island, and the Turks sent in troops. So there was a conflict with Turkey that might look like it kind of fits, but the military didn't democratize to persuade citizens to fight, because after Ioannidis' overthrow, leaders were determined to avoid war. This is pretty clear in the history. So the Joint Chiefs of Staff, after overthrowing Ioannidis, according to one historian, they agreed that war was impossible. The Turks, they tried to mobilize. The mobilization was such a visible failure that they realized they were not in any position to fight a war at that point. Karamanlis, after they appoint Karamanlis as this transitional prime minister, in the words of another historian, he at once made it clear that there could be no question of a military confrontation with Turkey and ordered demobilization. So this doesn't seem to fit. It wasn't that they were democratizing in order to motivate soldiers to fight, they were determined to avoid war. What about attempting to get future governments to provide more public goods? Well, no. Scratched my head, but I really couldn't think of a way that could apply. Was it a case of one elite faction broadening access in the hope of winning votes? Again, no. The junta was definitely not trying to win votes, and it didn't mean to democratize. So again, that just doesn't really apply. Was it a great compromise or pact, for instance, under Karamanlis, when Karamanlis comes back? Well, Karamanlis did initially form a government of national unity, but it was a government of national unity that deliberately and clearly, completely excluded the left. So it was not a broad compromise in any sense. And according to another of the historians, Karamanlis made decisions that were explicitly avoiding reaching any settlement, let alone a pact with other democratic political leaders. He wanted to keep his options open, and so he didn't commit to any across-the-board agreement that could look like a pact. So again, I don't think that really fits. In fact, none of the deliberate choice theories seem to fit in this case. That's the kind of reasoning that I went through with each case. Now, was this democratization by mistake? My answer is yes. It fits the case of military adventure. So the junta, as I said, didn't mean to democratize. It began a military confrontation with Turkey over Cyprus, but failed, and this undermined its own support base, so others in the army moved to get rid of the junta and return to civilian rule. Okay, and here you see the colonels on trial the next year. Okay, so that's the kind of thinking, the kind of analysis that I tried to do with each of these cases. What about robustness? Does it make a difference to the results if we look at particular periods? You might say, well, maybe it doesn't work for recent democratizations, but perhaps it does for older ones. Does it make a difference if we just look at cases of democratization that prove permanent? Because a lot of cases of democratization are followed by returns to authoritarian rule and possibly another democratization later. So what if we look at just the permanent ones? And then, obviously, the quality of the sources available on all these cases varies. So I tried coding the sources based on, first of all, how much was available, whether the historians disagreed, and in general, what was the quality. And I graded the cases on the basis of whether the sources were relatively more or less comprehensive. I graded from A to D. Okay, so I tried looking at the pattern of results, focusing on just particular subsets of the cases. And it's true that deliberate choice arguments do a bit better in the first wave cases. If you remember, there have been 3 waves of democracy. So the first wave was the early democratizations up to 1927. There, the deliberate choice arguments do a bit better, but still, the only one that looks reasonably good is elite party competition. And there, if we go by the Bosch criterion for democracy, there are only 16 cases in the first wave of democratization. And elite party competition could possibly have contributed in 6 of those 16 cases. Okay. But apart from that, no single argument helps to explain even 1/4 of the first wave cases. And in each wave, including the first wave, democratization resulted more often from mistakes than deliberate choices of the elites. And the results turn out to be quite similar whether we look at temporary democratizations or permanent democratizations, and whether we focus on all the cases or we just look at cases where the sources were more comprehensive more sources were available. So that didn't seem to make a big difference. Now, the gains and carrots. Of course, I'm not saying that all mistakes of dictators lead to democratization. Of course not. People make mistakes all the time. Most mistakes lead to nothing, right? When mistakes do prompt regime change, it must be the case that the underlying structural conditions must be right for democracy. So if you think about arguments about democratization, there are some which look at underlying, what are called structural factors, like the level of economic development, or sometimes inequality, or level of education, or something like that. I'm not focusing on those in this paper. What I'm looking at is specifically the question of what happens at the moment of democratization and what the elite, or the incumbents, do. So I'm looking at the agency part of the equation. Okay, so just because you have a mistake doesn't mean you automatically get democracy, okay? It depends on these other things like economic development. But if we want to explain how the elite comes to democratize, I think mistakes are much more important than was previously thought. Okay, so why do dictators make so many mistakes? Of course, on this I can make some suggestions. I can't prove that these are the right explanations, but they seem reasonable to me. First of all, common cognitive biases and limitations. So dictators may make mistakes for the same reasons we all make mistakes. We're all subject to certain cognitive biases and limitations, and psychologists have pointed to a lot that seem relevant here. So one is over-optimism. So for instance, psychologists find that we exaggerate the chances that our favorite team is going to win a sports match. Over-optimism is common, also overconfidence. So we tend to be too sure that we're right, that we understand. Among people who say they are 100% confident of something, they tend to be wrong 20% of the time, psychologists. Okay. So overconfidence. Dissonance reduction. So if a piece of information doesn't fit into the paradigm, doesn't fit expectations, we tend to ignore it. There apparently is something called the ostrich syndrome that psychologists have identified. This is a tendency to protect oneself from hearing bad news, to avoid bad news. And then the illusion of control. I like this one. So if you get people to flip a coin and guess which side is going to come out on top, right? And they have a string of successful results. They guess right. The whole string of coin tosses. They start to feel, even quite sophisticated people start to feel that they are somehow contributing to this result. And this is called the illusion of control. So if things have been going well, we tend to feel that it has more to do with our own control, our contribution, than perhaps chance. So all of these things together could help people to be vulnerable to mistakes. Those are things that are common between authoritarian leaders and everybody else, but there are also some particular pathologies that apply to authoritarian leaders. So hubris, I mentioned, and some medical and psychological specialists have said that hubris is actually an acquired personality disorder. It's not just some character trait. Then self-isolation. Many dictators have ended up over time isolating themselves, cutting themselves off from critical arguments. Bad news, that's the ostrich syndrome again, I guess, but isolating themselves in what's sometimes called an echo chamber. So leaders don't get told the bad news and they don't want to hear it. Superstition. I found that a surprising number of authoritarian leaders consulted fortune tellers. So in Africa, yeah, that's quite common, but even in other places. So Pinochet in Latin America and some others in Asia too consulted soothsayers or fortune tellers, and physical and mental deterioration. If a leader is unable to retire safely, then he'll try and stay in power for a long time. And it is actually the case, looking at data, that there tend to be more, that the frequency of very old leaders is higher in authoritarian states than democracies. And you naturally get some physical and mental deterioration. So cases of this, Mao could hardly talk in his final years. There was some question whether he had Parkinsonism. And in various other cases, Salazar in Portugal had a stroke, and his aides actually handed power in practice to his aide Gitano, but kept Salazar thinking that he was still making the decisions for about a year before he died. So, okay, so those are reasons why authoritarian leaders may be particularly prone to mistake. And then there are other things which have to do with the authoritarian environment. So polls may be less reliable in those settings because people are afraid of giving an answer that would seem disloyal. They falsify their preferences. And polls may be very unreliable and volatile because people don't have enough information. So if during an election campaign, the regime loosens up a little bit to increase the legitimacy of an election and allows the opposition suddenly to appear in the media, sometimes that can lead to very unexpectedly large shifts in public opinion. Okay, so so if you follow me in thinking that mistakes were important in democratization, does this have implications for other areas in political science? Well, yes, I think it does. There are other types of institutional change where mistakes have been very important. So one of these is in the selection of electoral rules, so proportional representation or majoritarian systems. It's quite hard to figure out in advance how these are going to affect a given political system. And if you look, there's a paper by Andrews and Jackman, which argues that if you look at both choices of the electoral system in Western Europe at the beginning of the 20th century and in the post-communist countries towards the end of the 20th century, very often incumbents supported electoral rules that later eliminated them from politics. So again, miscalculations. And then if we look at the spread of human rights treaties in the last 30 years, a lot of these were supported by authoritarian leaders who later became victims of the same treaties. So Pinochet, holding that plebiscite in 1988 wasn't his only mistake. In 1987, his government had signed on to the UN Convention Against Torture, and clearly Pinochet at the time didn't anticipate that in 11 years' time, 11 years later, a Spanish judge would be using that same convention to try and get him extradited to stand trial. So again, I think mistakes made by authoritarian leaders who think that signing on to these human rights treaties is going to be inconsequential and then end up in the International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia or Africa, actually, and realize that they did make a mistake. So, conclusions. Based on a comprehensive review of historical cases, democratization, it seems to me, was a deliberate choice of incumbents, and up to about a third of the cases, in about 2/3, incumbents didn't intend to democratize. But they ended up doing so because of mistakes that they had made. Common mistakes of dictators have included hubris, military ventures, slippery slope reforms, trusting covert Democrats, thinking that they're going to preserve the system when they don't, and the use of counterproductive violence. And finally, mistakes shouldn't surprise us in complex social situations that don't occur often enough for actors to learn from practice, like institutional change. So psychologists tell us that expertise is important in activities which are regular, which are repeated in a familiar manner, which allows people to practice. So things like playing chess or fighting fires, you can acquire real expertise in these. But in cases like institutional change, there's really very little opportunity to practice. And these are such complex social interactions that there's just enormous potential for mistakes. So I think we should expect mistakes in those settings. Now, for historians, probably everything I've said seems kind of obvious, because historians know that people make mistakes. On the other hand, for economists, and as you saw, the theories that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk were all pretty much, well, not all, but many of them were developed by economists. For economists, it seems very unnatural to explain things in terms of mistakes. It's to refer to play off the equilibrium path in the game as an explanation seems a very strange thing for a standard economist. That's changed a little bit since the behavioral economics revolution, but I think that revolution hasn't really hit economic history very much yet, or the analysis of the economics or the political economy of reform. So, yeah, I think what's really surprising is not that dictators make mistakes. Perhaps it's that dictators don't make more of them. So thank you very much.
We will take some questions now.
Yes.
One simple question. So how old should a mistake be to be coded as a mistake? Because I can give an example of revolution, democratization in Portugal, is coordination revolution. And basically the reason was not mistake by Salazar or Caetano, but it was very old decision to engage in these colonial wars and to make study military administration free that attracted many leftist officers. Right. Basically these officers were staged against the dictatorial government. So basically, how old should mistake be? Because we can eventually argue that any involuntary overthrow is a result of some mistake, maybe 10 years or 20 years before.
That's a very good question, and I don't have a good answer. I mean, I wouldn't have coded that as a mistake that was relevant in this case. But, if you go back, as you said, if you go back far enough, then, especially for dictators being in power that long, you can probably find mistakes. But I do think you need to be able to draw quite a tight relationship, quite a tight path from the mistake to the democratization or to the fall of the regime which leads to democratization. In that case, just intuitively, that feels like too distant a link. Right? I mean, it's not that after that mistake, anybody thought that democratization now was going to happen or had suddenly become more likely. So I could arbitrarily say within a year or two. But if I look at my cases, I'm sure that all the mistakes would be 5 years, 10 years, absolute maximum would probably all of them would be within 5 years. Of course, it's arbitrary. Yeah.
People make so many mistakes. How can you possibly decide what's the relevant mistake?
Well, by looking at the cases. I mean, obviously there are mistakes which are not relevant, right? So I have to be able to make an argument for myself that seems plausible that had they not made that mistake at a time when some other better course was available, then democratization wouldn't have happened. So most mistakes don't fit that.
But I'm talking about specifically when they are multiple mistakes that all relate to democratization. How could do you factor in that it might be multiple things? I mean,
yes.
I'm thinking about Poland myself in my studies, like in their democratization, and declaring martial law looked like a stroke of genius at the time because Jaruzelski gets an extra 7 years or something. But then later, when they're having elections, they say that was a major mistake. But then the way he designed the actual ballots was a mistake. So I'm saying, like people in general, but as you say, authoritarian leaders are actually people. They make so many, and they all kind of come together in this web for this perfect situation for democratization to happen. I'm just confused how you can put one and say, oh, it's this one.
Okay, yeah, I don't do that. I don't say it's just one mistake. Often it's multiple, and sometimes in my codings I'll say it was both hubris holding an election, it might be something else as well. So I'm not saying it's just one. In the case of Poland, I would say calling the election and allowing Solidarity to run, I probably coded that as a mistake because they didn't anticipate that Solidarity would win just about all the seats, or one of the seats that they were up for. I wouldn't go back as far, and this gets back to the previous question, I wouldn't go back as far as the introduction of martial law, because that seems a little bit distant.
I would say, sorry, as well, I would say that making a pact in that situation is like an intelligent thing to do. It seemed like the right case for so many people. They sort of agreed with what he was doing. But then one of the arguments is because they let them just cross the names off of the people they didn't like. That actually this is what swayed it from 50% to 99%. So I'm saying, I agree with everything you said, but I just find it really hard to know what to do with all that information.
The mistake for the Polish communists was to hold an election which they thought they could dominate in familiar ways, and then not managing to do that. So I think if they had known earlier that it was going to turn out into this rout for Solidarity, they could either not have held the election, or they would have manipulated it in a more effective, sophisticated way. So that's what I would say was the main mistake. So the detail of whether it was through the nature of the ballot papers or something, or to put that point more generally, that isn't crucial to matter. Thank you.
So why are you speaking about democratization? Because it sounds like that it is more general.
Yeah.
What will be the difference between regime change and democratization?
Good question. This paper is about democratization, but I do think that it's relevant to other regime changes too. So I think
You do think?
I do. Yeah, my hunch is the same. That in fact, it would be an interesting paper to write, or experiment to do, to just read about all the cases of failure of democracies. And I think probably in a lot of those cases one would find mistakes very important in a lot of those cases. Perhaps that seems less surprising to us, because we tend to think of democratization as a good thing. And so we tend to assume that there must have been some sort of rational, deliberate cause for it. Whereas democratic breakdown we think of as a bad thing, and therefore we're psychologically readier to see mistakes there. But yeah, exactly. I would like to, I do think this applies, as I said, to adopting human rights treaties, choosing electoral systems, and it probably applies also to other kinds of regime changes.
Then a follow-up to Kieran's question. It's about coding. The paper's title is Democracy by Mistake. You are largely talking about democratization by mistake, which does not necessarily lead to democracy. And in very many cases you outline this. So how would you code it? Democratization or democracy, the outcome? And maybe the second question, can we imagine a situation when an autocrat is not making a mistake, or something, he behaves the way which doesn't fit your notions of mistakes, and nonetheless something's happened. And
Absolutely.
I mean, maybe Portugal, the junior officers just overthrow the colonels. Now, how would this fit into your scheme?
Okay, so the second question, yes, there are cases where I don't find any mistake. Sometimes they fit the kind of deliberate democratization story, sometimes they don't. So there are some cases that sort of don't fit anywhere, but I don't think they're mistakes. Perhaps there was just a huge crisis. They did the best that they could in the circumstances. It wasn't enough, and the authoritarian regime was overthrown. So yes, that happens. The first question is democracy. Okay, so the way I can dodge that question is by saying, well, if we think how I'm coding democratizations, right? So I have these three definitions. One of those, the Bosch et al. Definition, is a dichotomous variable. Basically, they code as democracy all those countries in which at least 50% of the male adult population gets the vote and the head of the executive is elected in a reasonably free and fair election. So they would say yes, if it goes from 0 to 1, that's both democratization and movement to a democracy, right? Okay. So with the polity stuff, polity says it's a democracy if it has a polity 2 score of 6 or higher. My criteria for democratization using the polity scores don't necessarily correspond to that. It's an increase of 6 points within 3 years, or that crossing the threshold of 6 some of the time, but also crossing the threshold of 0. So in that case, yes, it's democratization. I can't claim that the end point is democracy. So yeah, that's kind of right, but I think that democracy by mistake sounds better than democratization.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll finish. Easier to say. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I had some rather banal questions. I'm just trying to wrap my head around sort of the assumptions behind the categorization and then behind the coding. So with respect to the, I guess the model behind your idea of mistakes, is it fair to say then that this relies on the fact that, so the category of mistakes would also include cases where the autocrat just cannot calculate utility property, right? Like they have some sort of like a prospect theory type situation where, you know, they have these 3 choices, this one should be best, but for whatever reason, it's not that they make a mistake, I guess, in the information and the calculation, they just like, for them, that what would in theory be optimal is not, for whatever reason, perceived to be optimal. Is that captured in those 2 categories, and if not, is it worth thinking about? The other one is, I think, related to many of these questions about coding, and I'm trying to think of a way that doesn't sound horribly accusatory to say it, so forgive me if this is somewhat undiplomatic. I'm curious, it seems like, right, there is the ability to overlap within different types of deliberate choice and within different types of mistakes, but between those categories there can never be overlap. Is that fair, or is there?
No, they can be overlapped.
Okay. I mean, the reason I ask you that is because, like, and it may be that I just misremember the case because I last encountered it in graduate school, which I guess is not so far away. But just some of the interpretations that I've heard, for example, of the Spanish translation are that it, in fact, is sort of a stereotypical type pact. And so for me, it was curious, and it relates to Denise's question about, like, how far in the past can the mistake be, to hear that actually it's not anything about, you know, Juan Carlos, but actually it's Franco messing up. So that would be a case where you could potentially have multiple sort of overlaps.
Absolutely. So you can have a mistake, and that changes. So basically, after the mistake, democracy becomes more likely, let's say. But that doesn't stop you having various things like pacts along the way. It does mean that you can't say the Francoist elite democratized deliberately because it had decided after these years of conflict with the left that it was better to just institutionalize a democratic way of solving the problem. Because that I don't think is what happened.
Sure.
So it's like, do you see what I'm saying?
I see what you're saying.
The mistake led to the democratization, I think,
Right.
in that case, but I'm not excluding elements of deliberate choice after that.
So just as a robustness check, and also to some extent as a sanity check, because you know you're going to get, every time you present this, somebody with a pet case that they just...
Well,
so,
please tell me if you have a pet case.
I don't, but I think that one of the things that would be useful to do is to see, based on this coding you've already done, in how many cases does it seem like, you know, the sort of traditional, particularly political science explanations, right, like from Latin Americanists say, how many of those seem to flow from mistakes? And then also, if you can find the opposite. So is it the case that, like, somebody starts making a pacted transition and then halfway through they screw up? Because I think that it won't change your results, but it might lend some interesting nuance. And also, I think it's useful because it seems to me like this is a piece trying to set out a research agenda. And so that would sort of be one of the logical next steps, right? To figure out, like, to what extent is this mutually exclusive? And if it's not, are there systematic patterns in the way that structural variables relate to this and the way that this relates to then deliberate choices.
Thank you, yeah, it's a good suggestion. Right, I mean, I could look at the cases. And how the mistakes interact with conscious, deliberate, rational, perhaps, decisions at different points in the path of these democratization is interesting, potentially important. I guess I would say I'm trying to stay modest and say all I'm saying is that mistakes were important for the outcome, and that I really couldn't make these deliberate choice arguments work in 2/3 of the cases. Which, you know, I had a hunch, but I didn't know it was going to be 2/3 of the cases. I had a hunch that the Esamogu-Robinson story fits certain cases, but really doesn't fit a whole bunch of others. And the same for each of these arguments. But I was surprised that it was, that.
Seriously?
So people make mistakes. Politicians make mistakes. Politicians in authoritarian regimes are more likely to make mistakes probably than politicians in democratic regimes, because in the second case they have more information and the system is eventually. But nevertheless, they can make mistakes as well. Does it make sense, what do you think, to contrast mistakes produced or made by authoritarian leaders with against mistakes which can be made by democratic leaders? Of course, probably here there is no reverse way go back from democracy to authoritarian rule, but nevertheless, different types of crisis or conflict situation, or just lost elections can be. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. And clearly some of the mistakes are also made by democratic politicians, but it doesn't lead to democratization.
Yes.
The context is different, but things like calling an election that you think you're going to win and then losing happens all the time, right, in democracies. So not all the time, but a lot of the time. And a lot of these things related to hubris, I think we can see in democracies too, and less often than in authoritarian states, because it takes time to really develop extreme hubris. Less time for some than for others, but still it takes some time. And democratic leaders tend not to rule for as long as authoritarian leaders. But clearly there are democratic leaders who start miscalculating because of overconfidence and all these other psychological biases. So yeah, it would be interesting to do that analysis. Thank you. Yeah.
Well, I personally understand that the really intimidating amount of work you did before these conclusions. So can you think about some ways of using observational data to understand whether some mistakes were influential, others did not, and so on. So I think that only through some really rather statistical analysis we can find some causal mechanisms and so on, because not many can do such great case studies, like hundreds of case studies. It's always, I think, influences of what mistakes the researcher does. So are there any statistical, ways to understand those mistakes?
The reason I did this project and that I did it in this way was because I don't think statistics, I think we run into problems when we try to do this with statistics. Not because statistics is necessarily bad for analysis, but because this type of project lends itself more to what, I hate the term, but some of my colleagues call it process tracing. The problem is, when you look at these cases closely, and you realize how people doing a statistical project would code them, there are all sorts of errors which are very natural to make. So there was a paper that somebody did which looked at whether you're more likely to get democratization or expansion of the franchise after revolutionary protests, or when there's fear of revolution. And they said this is a test of the Asimov-Robinson argument. And basically they looked for whether there were protests. Well, I found that when I just looked at my 201 cases, there were protests before democratization in the vast majority of cases. But those protests did not fit the Asimov-Robinson pattern. They just didn't fit the logic in most of the cases. So, for instance, let's suppose there's a revolutionary protest, then there's democratization. So you code it as fitting. The protests lead the elite to institutionalize democracy and commit to political redistribution. Well, some of those cases, the revolution won. So, like Louis Philippe, the incumbents were overthrown. So it's not the incumbent elite democratizing in response to the threat of revolution. It's revolution leading to a new incumbent who then democratizes. But if we just sort of counted up the cases, defining our variables in a kind of convenient way, we would miss that. So that's why I tried to do it by looking at the history. And the kind of, so I'm not making any general causal arguments because I can't with this kind of design. I'm just looking at cases in which democratization occurred. So, that's selecting on the dependent variable. One couldn't try to make a causal argument, even if it makes sense, that mistakes cause democratization. What I think I can do, and maybe you'll disagree, is argue about specific cases that, based on the history, a certain mistake caused a path of developments democratization. Now, is that the kind of causal argument that we respect when we look statistically? No, it's just a different type of evidence. But there were problems with any way to pin down causality, and I think people are raising more and more questions about the statistical techniques, which we've, I think, in the last 10 years come to feel very confident about for establishing causality. I think people are becoming a little bit worried that perhaps those techniques aren't quite as reliable and certain as we thought.
But I think that causally we can definitely explain the fact that 2/3 actually of democratizing events were made by mistake. So basically I think we have to find, and you even suggest how we can find some general rule, but it seems to me that most of those rules are kind of not falsifiable, because these psychological arguments are not really testable on dictators, because we cannot even make an experiment with any dictator, even if he's dead.
Right.
So we cannot actually understand what were the reasons why he did what he actually did. So do you think that there is even a place for kind of behavioral economics in politics in understanding of dictators' behavior? Because for me it sounds like really weird.
Well, I think if we don't have something like that, then we're going to get the wrong answers. We're going to understand things in the wrong way. I wouldn't say that it's not falsifiable if you claim that a given dictator acted in a certain way because of some cognitive bias. It's very difficult to test that. But the kind of ways one could go about it would be to look for very detailed information from the dictator himself, from those around him, and just see if there's any evidence there or a frame of mind. And I wasn't able to go very deep for many of these, but for instance, for Louis Philippe, there are some interesting sources. So, and you have to think about every source, whether they had some particular angle on the case, which might distort their judgments. But Tocqueville wrote a lot about Louis Philippe and gave various interpretations of why he made those particular mistakes. Louis Philippe's own son wrote to his brother saying, "Our father has reached this age when people become inflexible, and you can't argue with them," words to that effect. So that sort of puts a little bit more evidence on the side of, well, narrow thinking because of age. So is it falsifiable? Is it not falsifiable? I think we need to ask, how strong is the evidence as judged with historical criteria used in historical, and clearly, some of these cases can be made with greater confidence than others. But I don't think statistics is a magic bullet either. That's I guess what I'm saying. I think to really understand these cases, when there are only 200 of them or so, we really need to look at the cases. And just looking at sort of patterns within these 200 cases using statistics has, I think, led us astray a little bit. Yeah.
How do you distinguish between cases of calculation errors, miscalculating probabilities, and lost gambles? For example, in case of Polish elections, why were the communists wrong? Why did they miscalculate about the results of elections, the probable results, and not just lost the gamble? How do you compare that?
Well, by looking at what they say, so there's a great quote from one of the Communist Party leaders talking to a journalist that night after the results came in. And it says he was saying, no one in their wildest dreams expected that this would happen. And there's a lot of accounts saying that the communists, not just the communists, Solidarity leaders too, were very surprised by the outcome. So that gives me some confidence that they thought actually they had a good probability of doing much better. Right? So that sort of evidence.
But maybe they did have a good probability. It's just that they were very unlucky.
Well, then think about what the probability means. Yeah, okay, yeah, that's a point that I should think about. Thank you. I think if they had, okay, because we never absolutely know the objective probabilities. I think you can reconstruct the case, and in retrospect, you can see that the probability of Solidarity doing well was much higher than people realize, right? Would that seem reasonable? People didn't recognize the level of support for them, okay? So that implies that it was a miscalculation rather than just they were extremely unlucky. And in a sense, in all these social interactions, when we say there's a certain probability of something, one way to understand that is as saying there's a whole bunch of stuff we don't really know about, missing information, and we think that this missing information would sort of push in one direction rather than the other. And then when you find out what that missing information was, perhaps that can be used to evaluate the prior judgment of probabilities. I hope that works. Yes.
You argue that the ability to make a mistake is high for a dictator, and it looks very likely that all the dictators make mistakes. But under some conditions, this mistake leads to a regime change, and under some conditions, they do not. So can you make any, from what you have read and so on, can you see some tendency, in what cases these mistakes do lead to the regime change?
Right. Well, you could say that the kind of mistakes that lead to regime changes are the kind of mistakes that lead to basically the fall of the old regime. And then there's the question whether the next regime is a different type of regime or the same type of regime. Now that question, personally, there's huge debates about this. Personally, I think economic development is a factor that is very important. So different elements of economic development, educational poverty and so on, tend to support democracy at those kind of forks in the road when the old regime has fallen. I think people disagree about how strong the evidence is for that, but that would be my take on it. If dictators make a mistake which doesn't lead to collapse of their regime, then yes, it's not going to lead to democratization. Or at least severe weakening of the regime.
I can assume that there could be the cases that similar mistakes in two different countries could lead to very different.
Absolutely. But I mean, the way I think about that is, okay, you have the mistakes, and then you have underlying conditions. And I'm not saying that all mistakes lead to democratization, because it depends on the interaction of the mistake with the underlying conditions. The question, what underlying conditions make a certain mistake explosive, leading to democratization, is another question which I don't have a full answer to at this point, but I have priors based on other work that I've done which sort of emphasize economic development.
Just going back to what you're saying about us kind of having our own cognitive bias when it comes to democracy being a good thing, couldn't this research have been done in reverse? Couldn't you say how often did some actor go out and create democracy by accident? From the point of view of people protesting, but not actually meaning to create a regime, just wanting, a better price for bread, for example. Couldn't it be done exactly in reverse from the other point of view?
That's very interesting. I mean, clearly some of the protests which destabilize an old order have to do with democracy and some don't. And I did in fact collect that information as I was going through. For a different reason, but I could look at it and summarize the patterns. I mean, the reason I was collecting it was because I had an earlier paper which found that the level of economic development really matters for democratization if there's just been a leader turnover in the authoritarian regime. And a criticism I got about that, a fair point, was, well, maybe you get leader turnover in authoritarian regimes when there's a strong movement for democratization. And maybe you get those strong movements for democratization in more economically developed countries. So I was collecting data to be able to say, well, how often was the leader turnover and the democratization, how often were they both caused by strong pressure for democratization, strong revolutionary movement for democratization? So I have that information in short, and I could look at it and see. But I think it's tricky because there'll always be at least one person in the crowd who wanted democracy, right? It's hard to generalize about these things. And democracy is never a mistake for everyone. Right? I mean, there's always people who want it, I would say. It's very hard to think of a case where absolutely nobody wanted a more democratic order. It's easier to think of cases where the incumbent regime didn't want it. So I guess that's my answer.
So the structural factors that you discussed push leaders to make those mistakes. Will be the role of agency in this whole process?
Well, I don't have very strong arguments about structural factors leading leaders to make mistakes. I think a lot of it is just very hard to predict. The sort of things that I talked about, age of leaders, maybe. But at the end of the paper, I try to think a little bit about what factors might predispose leaders to make mistakes. The type of authoritarian regime, so there are some types of authoritarian regime where there's more vetting of the top decisions. So in a military junta, where it really is a junta, so all the generals participate, then they may kind of review the decisions more thoroughly. In a one-party dictatorship, there may be more collective leadership at the top, which would lead to decisions being subjected to more critical discussion and thought, compared to a personalistic dictatorship where it really is just one person saying, we'll do this, and nobody else brave enough to object. So type of regime might affect the frequency of mistakes. Age of the dictator or tenure of the dictator might affect frequency and so on. But those are kind of characteristics of regime rather than structural underlying factors.
well.
Thank you for your.
Thank you very much indeed.